I'm just waiting for confirmation that we're recording at the moment. That's us, we're recording. So I'll now take this adherent for the meeting of the Executive Committee of the 26th of May 2021. Councillor Allison, I see that you're here also. Councillor Allison. Councillor Bradley?
Here.
Thank you. Councillor Brown, I see that you're here. Can I just confirm that you are here?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, that's great. Councillor Callaghan.
Apologies for Councillor Callaghan, she might be able to join us later.
Thank you. Councillor Chalmers, I see that you're here. Also Councillor Convery. Councillor Cooper, you're here, as is Councillor Corbett. Councillor Craig is here. Councillor Devlin. Councillor Dorman. Councillor Fagan, you're here?
Yes, I'm here, Pauline.
Thank you. Councillor Faulkner is here. Councillor Hamilton is here. Councillor Logan. Nothing from Councillor Logan?
Yes, no, I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Loudon is here. Councillor Lowe.
Apologies for Councillor Lowe is unwell.
Thank you. Councillor McAdams?
She'll be coming, Pauline. She's running a wee bit, Monique's running a wee bit late.
That's no problem, thank you. Councillor McCreary, I see that you're here. Councillor McGuigan has intimated his apologies. I understand that Councillor MacDonald, you are substituting for Councillor McGuigan, is that correct?
That's correct, Pauline.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Miller?
Yes, thanks, Pauline.
Thank you. Councillor Nealon?
I'm present, Pauline.
Thank you. I have apologies from Councillor Nelson. Councillor Harrow, I understand that you're substituting for Councillor Nelson.
I am, yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Ross is here. Councillor Shearer?
Here.
Thank you. Councillor Wardhall?
Here.
And I see that Councillor Wilson is here. There are also a number of officers present at the meeting this morning, and I'll pass back to you, Chair, now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pauline. We'll go on with the business then. Item 1 is any declarations of interest. Do we have any? No intimations. We'll move on to item 2, which is the minutes of the previous meeting held on 28th of April. That's on pages 5, 12. And before we go on to asking any colleagues if they have any business coming from the previous meeting, can I possibly ask Geraldine if she has any update on item 7 of that last agenda, which was the live streaming? If she has any updates, she could possibly let the colleagues know.
Thank you, Chair. I can advise that since our last meeting and including our last meeting, we have live streamed 7 meetings to the Council YouTube page. We are still investigating the possibility of subtitling the live meetings, but we haven't found a solution as yet. There are Teams live captions that can be activated, but we've tried that out and they're not reliable. However, any viewer can access the YouTube subtitling the next day. There is a time lag from the time it's uploaded to the committee page before you can access it. As far as the other recordings subtitling have gone, we have uploaded 2 subtitled meetings since our last meeting. We have we've got 15 low-res proofs from the company to just check and return to them. And we have 11 high-res proofs returned for final check. And we have 6 transcripts. That's the first stage to check. So they are all underway. The backlog that we had are underway, and these should be up within the next few weeks, depending on how quickly my team can get them back. There has unfortunately been a delay, which I need to apologise for, but that was because there's quite a high number of the administration team who were involved in election work, and that took priority. So the remaining team just didn't have the time to get this done, in addition to the normal committee work and other work that they were picking up. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Geraldine. I see Robert has his hand up. Robert?
Yes, thanks very much. Just in passing, maybe say on the live streaming, and this sounds extraordinarily cumbersome and slow, the whole arrangement, so hopefully we can get something that will work a bit better out of all of that. I was going to ask, though, about the Stewartfield one at item 2, and just for confirmation as to when the members' presentation would be made. Just really maybe minute that. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks very much. Do we have any idea when that would happen? Michael, do you have any information on that?
Yes, Chair. We took the strategic business case to the Chief Exec's group last Thursday, so it passed through there. It will now go to the Cabinet on Tuesday. So on the assumption that it is supported by the Cabinet, officers will then work on the OBC, and then that will provide the further details that we indicated when we spoke about it back in March. So to answer the question more directly, it will be a post-summer, perhaps into autumn, before we have that sufficient details, but we always gave the commitment to have a member session before we report back to committee, which is programmed for the end of this year, Chair. So hopefully that will give a sufficient update for Councillor Brown and other members. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. I don't see any other hands up, so I would move the previous minutes.
I'll second, Chair.
Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Move on to item 3, which is the additional funding from the Scottish Government and other external sources, which is on pages 13 to 16, and I would ask Paul to give a report on this, please.
Thanks, Chair. This is the additional funding paper from the Scottish Government and other external sources. This is the only finance monitoring paper that we've got on this agenda. The reason for that is we're now past the year end. We never report in terms of financial monitoring. During May, we work on the accounts and we report them in June. So that will go to the meeting at the end of June. So in terms of the additional funding, what we've got is £8.5 million of additional revenue funding, which you can see coming into year 2021-22. That's the year we're now in. The two big amounts that are in there, there's £40 million nationally, and it says there finance order budget pressures. And you'll remember I talked to you about this amount. The amount we're getting is £2.367 million in the paper that went to the last committee. And the other big amount that's in there is an amount of £4.163 million, and that is the council's money to make the low income pandemic support payments. And this is the payment of £130. That was announced as part of the Scottish Government's budget paper on the 9th of March 2021, and our intention is to make these payments before the deadline for payment, which is in October. So again, Chair, any questions, happy to take them. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I don't see any hands up from any colleagues. Can I move the recommendation?
I'll second, Chair.
Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. If we move on to items for decision, item 4 is the expansion of Newton Farm Primary Schools in pages 17 to 22. And can I please have Tony to give this report?
Thank you, Chair, and good morning. The purpose of the report is to provide information on pupil projections at Newton Farm Primary School, outline the physical expansion proposals for the school and the Scottish Government funding approval, and to seek council capital funding for the expansion and consider the planning annual revenue consequences of such an extension, and indeed the impact of staffing for increased pupil numbers. In section 3, you will see the background of the report. Currently, the school has 14 mainstream classes and a physical capacity of 420, and that's based on the average planning capacity of 30 pupils per class. In section 3.2, we outline that currently there are 489 mainstream pupils, and the August 2024 prediction within the current catchment allocation is 805. You will also see we manage this current situation through mobile teaching units and second classroom teachers, but of course that's a sustainable long-term model. And also in terms of the increased numbers, you can see that we've already been to committee and asked to look at the capital programme and indeed a design work on the extension of the school. Section 3.3 outlines that would be limited to 7 classrooms, and that's to do with the building footprint and how we would make that up, because obviously we're looking at dining accommodation, PE facilities and outdoor space for children and young people themselves. In section 3.3.3, it is worth pointing out that in the initial planning and design process, the building was to be done in 2 phases, depending on the acceleration of the children coming in to the school building itself. And in 3.4, we go into the detail of how we come up with these kinds of analysis, and it talks about the spike effect in a new community and how quickly we may see that spike effect, and we have seen that fairly quickly within the Newton community itself. But for us, it's to try to manage it within the overall school population and indeed taking into account some of the other local schools. And that's up in section 3.5, where we do talk about the options that were being considered about how we manage this spike process, but also how we manage that catchment activity. And indeed, our options that we're currently considering will present a proposal for further looking at the catchment area within the local community as well. And that's to manage all of the numbers and also how we may manage over a longer period of time as well. In section 4, we outline Newton Farm does have a couple of nursery classes and some additional support needs provision. However, that's not done on a catchment basis for us. And for us, in terms of our planning, we've already opened 2 new early years centres down in the community in Milburn Early Years Centre, which is just in Newton Bray and Newton itself, and of course Lightburn, which is just about a mile away in Mill Road. We also have Westburn Nursery in the area, which again is about a mile and a half along Westburn Road, for those that would know the community well. Section 5 moves on to the Learning Estate Improvement Programme funding. That's the Scottish Government funding. That's a £1 billion programme across this and being managed by the Scottish Futures Trust, and how the councils apply for additional finance, and that 50% of the costs effectively of a council's capital project would be invested through it. And in section 5.2 outlines there are measurable outcomes that come along with that as well. In sections 5.3 to 5.6, it talks about how that process works. Although it's based around 50% of the annual capital costs, it's an annual payment over 25 years, and there are, of course, some funding conditions within that funding model, and they're explained through 5.3 to 5.6 itself, whether it be on the condition of the building or energy efficiency or how digitally enabled it is, or indeed economic growth within the community. The good news is in 5.7 is that we have been successful in Newton Farm for the primary school extension project has been successful with the Scottish Government. Section 6 rightly points out that any school role growth requires additional teachers and indeed additional support staff. Section 7 then goes into the financial implications. It outlines that 4.39 million are the capital costs as detailed in section 3.3, and we've already had the 1.70 million as part of the design programme to allow us to look at the design process. The balance being 4.22 million, and that would be added to the Council's General Services Capital Programme in 2021-22, 22-23 and 23-24, and the sums and totals are there. We also have contributions from the Newton Farm Community Growth Area of 0.790 million, and that takes the Council's contribution and borrowing to 3.430 million. We can also see from the Scottish Government funding and that 25 years payment of £0.132 million per annum. And that does allow us to look at the life cycle costs, and that contributes to the kinds of finance that we require in order to run schools on a yearly basis as well. Section 8 talks about the climate change, sustainability, environmental implications, and the council requirements in that respect would be met. And again, we can see there are implications for the Scottish Government conditions of their grant as well. Section 9 outlines how we are currently managing the temporary situation around the mobile teaching units, and how many we have on site at the moment. Importantly, in section 9.2, subject to approval, what we are trying to look at is construction to start in July 2021 with completion for August 2022. And if I could refer the committee back to section 2.1 of the report, Chair, the committee is asked to approve the 6 recommendations as outlined. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. I see I have several hands raised. Councillor Loudon, Councillor Brown, Councillor Allison and Councillor Nealon. Can I take them in that order? Councillor Loudon.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks very much, Tony, for going through that. This is in my ward, so I know the area very well. I think that it's fair to say that the increase in numbers is quite startling when you see it written down there. And obviously what we've got in front of all of us today is the legacy of what has gone before in terms of calculations that have been presented to committees in the past and decisions that have been made in the past. And that's not a slight on previous administrations working with what they'd been told at the time and what had been predicted in good faith at the time as well. I think it's very easy with hindsight to say this was predictable because of the nature of the area. For those of you who don't know, Newton Farm, especially with the motorway extension, is now very much considered commuter territory for a lot of people who work in the city. And you know what the housing market in the city was like at the time as well. We were one of the families who had moved into the area, albeit not quite up to Newton Farm, but thereabouts, who moved out from Glasgow with a baby about 12 years ago and then grew on, had another kid and came along and took up some school places for you. So some of it wasn't predictable, and Tony explained that spike effect really well, I thought, this morning. I think it would be remiss of me not to express some of the frustrations that have been felt by some of the families in my ward about the fact that the expansion is necessary at the moment, and it is absolutely necessary at the moment. Again, with hindsight, is maybe to do with communication with those families and with the community in the wider sense at the time, if this was always something that we knew was a possibility. But it is absolutely the right way forward at the moment to make sure that the accommodation that we've got in place for the children who live in this area at the moment is of the same quality of what they would expect and what they would get elsewhere. I know nursery placements were briefly mentioned in the report, and Tony covered that as well. Thanks for going over that. There are some spanking brand new, lovely standalone nurseries up near this as well, which I hope to be able to go and visit as soon as I can. Finally, I think it'd be remiss not to mention this as well. All of us ward councillors and the constituency MSP have been expressing concerns over several years about what this could potentially mean, the growth in primary school numbers could potentially mean for high school provision in the area. Now, again, just for background, for those of you who don't know, we're working with the decision that was made in the past to prop up another high school, essentially. But I appreciate all of the work that officers are doing just now to look at rebalancing catchments and then about provision more generally going forward. I think all of that is positive, albeit something we need to keep a close eye on. And finally, just a thank you to officers for the time that they've taken to communicate all of this with parent councils about the rebalancing process, and not just with this particular school, but with other local schools in the area as well, and to talk to parents who are engaged in those groups with how best to talk to other parents and the wider community. That's me just now. Thank you very much, Tony.
Thanks very much, Katie. Robert?
Yes, thanks very much, Chair. I'm grateful to Katie for that. I wasn't immediately aware, I think the rest of us were either, that Katie had made such a contribution to the spike that's been talked about here. Can I ask, if I may, 3 things, really echoing, I think, some of the comments made. First of all, the spike talks about 805 children. Now, as I said at the leaders' meeting, that's a large number of people. When I went to secondary school in Huntly, our secondary school had 600. And it was regarded as like the big school, you know, with all the sort of worries of people going to these large numbers and so forth. Against the background of, you know, children with autism problems, children with special needs of various kinds, the desires for smaller schools, I just wonder if that size of school has got some implications, educationally speaking, that the director might perhaps have any concerns of. So that's point 1. Point 2 is on the nursery thing. I accept entirely that there are nursery provisions around. We don't operate by catchments. On the other hand, you know, families have to manoeuvre the whole issue of getting sort of primary school children to school as well as nursery school children. We're talking in terms of climate change and reducing travel. So it's not, frankly, hugely desirable that you have to go down, I mean, for example, to Westburn, quite a busy and difficult road, to another nursery school rather than having something in the area. I just wonder if that is an issue we should be having a bit closer look at. And then finally, on the secondary schools issue, this has been an issue for some time. But again, 805 children in a primary that didn't exist some time ago. You've got also, Hallside Primary as well, which my wife used to teach at. We have the sort of history of being, as Katie touched on, behind the curve a little bit in provision of schools and things like that in these general areas. Does that not have implications, quite serious implications, frankly, for the need for a secondary school in an area like the far end of Cambuslang halfway going forward? Is that not an implication we should be looking quite seriously at?
Thanks, Robert. Tony,
Thanks,
could
Chair.
you come back and answer some of Robert's comments?
Thanks, Chair. Will do. Thanks, Councillor Brown. Probably just on the three of them. In terms of the size of the school, that's probably why we're keeping it to that 7 class extension. That would be a school size of 630. In terms of that 805, obviously, and we outline that in the paper as well, just about in 3.5, where we're saying we will look at the catchment areas. If you take, and you've given Hallside as a very good example of that. Hallside, which was a big school, is below. It's a very good school in the community. It's very well respected within the community, but it's not anywhere close to its capacity. And as part of our planning process, have always kept in mind there might be a need for some realignment. And again, Councillor Brown, you will remember years ago we dealt with a Hallside spike as well. And so from time to time, what we need to then do is realign those catchments to utilise an excellent school in that community that is right within the heart of Hallside and indeed borders on Newton Farm itself. So that allows us within that 1 mile radius, in actual fact, of Newton Farm itself. In terms of the nursery places, Milburn is within Newton Farm. It was in the Newton Farm community. So it's on my memory serves me correctly. It's on Newton Bray. So in actual fact, the nursery itself is within that community. It's within walking distance within that community. Again, I accept timescales for families and drop-off. We do have nursery classes, but you're never in the kind of school environment you have going to have satisfy that complete alignment. And indeed, not all children who attend Newton Farm nursery class attend Newton Farm primary. Some of them attend St Charles as well. So I think that we need to keep that in mind, that you're never going to get that perfect match. I think the good news is our standalones do 8 till 6, Monday to Friday, so there is more flexibility in the hours. It's not around a balanced 9 till 3 situation as well. But finally, around the secondary school provision, we do take a close look at that. We monitor that all of the time. We do believe with the current secondary provision, and again, if you take Cathkin, you take Stoneline, you take Uddingston Grammar, across that estate, young people do travel across a bit wider distances to secondary schools, and we can manage that provision. The reality, as we all know, that building a high school in a community can sit somewhere between, depending on the size, depending on what you do, anything shy from 35 to 50 million pounds, and then the very significant annual revenue costs that go along with that. So for us, if we have existing resources, and we need to look at the efficient and maximum use of our existing resources in order to do that. That can sometimes mean changing the footprint of the secondary school, can look at some degree of changing of the some classroom repositioning, or just making sure that we can meet the needs of the curriculum. We can do that, but to reassure you that we do monitor that, and we are continuing to monitor that, because I'm very conscious of what comes out of the community and the discussions with local elected members, and indeed with what some of the local community council is saying as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Tony. Can I bring in Alec?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Start off, Katie was suggesting a lot of this was hindsight. It's not. These things were all discussed about 10 years ago, when the development area was starting off, as to the capacities required, and we were assured at that time that the spike had been taken account of. Now, information can change, but it's certainly not hindsight that these issues have been raised with. The one Originally, there was developers' contributions that were to provide the primary schooling for this area. And I note from the papers that further payments are to be made when there's just over 700 houses completed, I think it was in the paper. My understanding is there's about 2,000 in the whole development area. Does that mean that eventually there will be sufficient developers' contributions to pay for the increased education provision? And secondly, the issues that have been raised here, we have another major development area down in East Kilbride. Are the lessons being learnt from this to ensure we do not have the same problems down in East Kilbride?
Can I bring you in on that, Tony?
Yes, of course. Maybe just, and also hopefully Michael, as he has thankfully put his hand up around Section 75 and developers' contributions, because he has an expertise within that. But for, I suppose my point of that, Councillor Allison, is that we would always have a mixture of funding. The developers' contributions will not necessarily pay for all. That will be part of, if we take Scottish Government funding, which has been a significant part of this as well, we take our own council capital funding and indeed developers' contributions. And both Paul and Michael are obviously wanted to come in. And maybe the second part is where you were saying about learning lessons. Just to be clear, this was going to be a two-phase build. This was planned as a two-phase build. And that was also the realignment of the catchment of Hallside. And again, for clarification, if you take the development of a new primary school, you simply, even though, and this is not just about children coming into the community, you don't always know when those children will go to that primary school. And the very practical example of that is if there's primary schools that are nearby and children are already going to that primary school, sometimes the families will keep the children in that primary school. They also have the right to keep the sibling in that primary school as well. So it's never as straightforward as an accelerated activity that people move into the community and everybody then moves across. What we've seen is actually been the success of the school. We've seen the way in which the school has been successful, and we've seen the way that the housing has been accelerated. But hopefully at this point, Councillor Ross, if you don't mind, to Michael and Paul.
Yeah, I'll bring in Michael, and then Paul can come in after Michael.
Okay. Thanks, Chair. So I think maybe just to go back and put this in context is that the Section 75, the developers' contributions for the Phase 2 of the community growth area goes back probably just over 10 years or so. So the projections for education requirements were made at that time, and again, following a fairly robust process, which has served us well across the whole of South Lanarkshire. And I'll come back to the East Kilbride point near the end. So the projections were made, and then therefore the planning assumptions were taken forward. And I think picking up what Tony was saying, it was always envisaged that the school would be two phases, but the second phase is now larger than we anticipated because of, I think as Tony has said, the success of the school, the success of the area. But I would say that the planning assumptions have served as well across the patch, and I think this is probably seen as an exception. In terms of the funding for the school, it was actually made up of capital contributions from the council because we had to deal with a spike within Hallside Primary School at the time. There was also significant developers' contributions from the landowner and the single developer at the time, and also city deal funding to accelerate the actual delivery of the school. So there was a cocktail of packages in there. But I think in terms of developers' contributions, once the Section 75 is signed, and I think it was signed around about 2012, that's a signed contract. We can't look back retrospectively to developers. That has to be dealt with and addressed by the council and or the Scottish Government through other funding. And just lastly, Chair, just in terms of lessons learned, we are planning for a new primary school as part of the community growth area in East Kilbride. And I think it's probably fair to say that projections, etc., that there will be a degree of lessons learned there to ensure that the school is sized up appropriately. But there's a balance to be struck that you don't build a school which is too large and therefore part of it is actually obsolete and has running costs that you don't want. So it's very much a balanced approach there, Chair. So hopefully that addresses the points of Alex Allison and Councillor Allison, and maybe Paul wants to come in now.
Yeah, Okay, thanks, Paul.
Okay, thanks, Chair. It was really just to make an offer to Councillor Allison. I can offline take you through in detail the funding package for the original school and the extension, but just to put a wee bit of context on it for the community, a bit of context on it for the committee. In terms of the new school plus the additional extension, you're talking about a facility that's worth about £17.75 million. In terms of council funding, it's just under a quarter of that's had to go in once we take into account the government funding that's been made available. So that's for the whole package, for the new school and for the extension. But the offer's there to Councillor Allison. I'm happy to go through the package in detail. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. You take that up with Paul after this, Alec. Okay.
Yeah, I will do, but ask the specific question about further contributions at the moment, contributions are going to be made up to about 700 units. I'm led to believe that it's nearer 2,000 in that development area. Is there further funding still to come in under Section 75 that may alleviate some of this borrowing?
Michael, can you come back on that?
Chair, the short answer to that is no, because the Section 75 was signed back in 2012, and then that concludes the developers' contributions. As I said in my kind of longer answer, you can't look back retrospectively once effectively a contract has been signed. But I would reiterate that it was always seen as a phase 2, and at 7.2 of the papers there are further contributions of just under £800,000, but they were planned for. We can't reopen the Section 75 because of this issue. We legally can't do that. So that's the short answer, Chair. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I bring in Lynn, please?
Thank you, Chair. I've just got a couple of questions, and I think they've partially been answered. But 3.5.3, you said you're going to use other available accommodation in the area. The development is quite unusual. It is actually massive. It's like a town on its own almost. What is the other available accommodation in that area? You've mentioned Hallside and Milburn Nursery, but is there anything else specifically that you have in mind?
Thanks, Councillor Neal. The Hallside Primary School has sufficient capacity for probably about 450, I think, 400, and its role at the moment is sitting about just over 200. So there's actual capacity within the school itself. Yeah. We believe between the two schools, and I would point out again that Hallside is an excellent primary school within the area and is very well respected within the community. So we believe that there's an opportunity to realign. It sometimes takes, again, the way in which we would do that, we would consult with the community. Of course, there's a formal process. I wouldn't want to preempt a formal consultation process with the community, but we will go back to the community and look to try to change the catchment boundaries.
Thank you. And with your indulgence, Chair, I mean, I think we've touched on this as well, but we've talked about lessons learned. And as I said, it is quite an unusual development in its size. My understanding is that some of this has come about because of amendments to original planning applications where they've put up more larger houses, which has encouraged larger than average family sizes. Talking about lessons learned, are we going to do more joined up thinking, and is there going to be more liaison between planning when these amendments come in, between planning and education, for example, to kind of give them a preemptive warning about possible increased capacity?
I'm not sure if you can answer that, Tony, or whether Michael would come in on that.
Councillor, I see that Michael has his hand up. I would say that we work very closely, and while there'll never be a fully exact science, the first thing I would say is that, but obviously Michael can look at the very specifics around the planning, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
Michael.
Yeah, so again, I would emphasise that this issue strikes me as being very much the exception. It's quite a significant exception, albeit, but it is an exception. But to give Councillor Neal the comfort, there is an internal group made up of all resources and services that look at planning applications as and when they come in to understand what implications it has for roads, or implications it has for education, community facilities, and also our contribution towards affordable housing as well. So there is very much a joined up approach already, and I've certainly got the comfort that that works. I think what has happened here, and as Tony's described, this is an exceptional circumstance where the success of the school and the area has resulted in this spike and in needing to enlarge the phase 2 part of the school. And I kind of labour on the point, there was always going to be a phase 2. It's just larger than we had planned for. So I certainly would give the comfort that there is very much kind of joined up thinking. But projections are projections, and sometimes they can be just projections at that. So hopefully that'll give you the comfort, Councillor Naylor.
Thanks very much. Can I ask Katie to come back in? Thanks.
Thanks, Chair. I know I've spoken already. I'll try and be brief. I just wanted to go back to what Councillor Allison said for a second, because I think language is important very in this context. So I want to touch about my use of hindsight here. I want to take care to point out that calculations which were provided by officers at the time, which were the basis of decisions which were made, were done so in good faith. And I don't want to imply anything otherwise. As Tony has touched on, this is complicated, and there are sort of known unknowns in the mix as well when a new estate is built like this. Without making the committee think my family is entirely responsible for causing educational chaos in Camglen. We'd also in the past taken up an offer to keep a placement which was offered to us after a catchment review, as did many others. So just to reiterate the point that I'd made earlier, this was always seen as a possible phase 2. What I had said earlier was I think maybe that if we hadn't done such a good job of communicating that to the wider community and to parents at the time. And ironically, that part of the problem, of course, might be that if you've moved into the area, you hadn't seen the discussions in the local newspaper and with the community councils at the time that might be an option. We've now got a very active community council in the ward, much more so than when I first became councillor there, very active parent councils, and this definitely an emerging sense of community within some of the newest bits of the new builds as well, albeit through less traditional means like Facebook residents groups and so on. So needless to say, they're keeping a very close eye on what's happening in the area, and I'm sure we'll be interested to hear about this.
Thanks very much, Katie. I don't see any other hands raised, so I'm going to... Lynn, I see you've still got your hand up. Is that a legacy hand? Thanks very much. There'll be no further hands up. I'm going to move the recommendations.
I'll second, Chair.
Can we agree the recommendations?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Can we move on then to item 5, which is Community Wealth Building Commission, pages 23 to 26, and I would ask Paul to give a report on this, please.
Thanks, Chair. So this picks up on the Community Wealth Building strategy that was approved at the Executive Committee back in March. In terms of governance arrangements, that laid out the formation of a Community Wealth Building Commission, and that's really to deal with the governance arrangements around how we take forward the Community Wealth Building strategy. So in order to get that place, and to get that in place and to get this moving forward with yourselves, we're looking basically to get approval on the membership of that commission. Now, in terms of the terms of reference of the commission, which are covered at 4.2, they're as per the strategy which came before you back in March. As is the membership and frequency of meetings, we've taken that on and developed it in terms of a bit of detail. And you can see at 5.2, there are the specifics of the proposed membership are laid out in detail there. So what's being proposed is the Chief Executive be authorised to finalise the membership in liaison with political group leaders. So going back to the recommendations, again, back to that strategy, noting the formation of that commission, looking for approval of the proposed membership is laid out at 5.2, and looking for noting that the Chief Executive be authorised to finalise the membership of the commission in liaison with group leaders. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks very much, Paul. I was really happy to see the terms of reference here were really inclusive and plan to engage with local organisations. So I'm very happy, and I'm quite happy to see if there's any comments made by any of our colleagues here. I don't see any hands raised, so I'll move the recommendations.
I'll second, Chair.
Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Can we now move on to item 6, which is recommendations referred from the Climate Change Committee, pages 27 to 30. And I would ask for Geraldine to give this report, please.
Thank you, Chair. The report is seeking approval of staffing proposals that were endorsed by the Climate Change and Sustainability Committee on the 28th of April. The background to the proposals are set out in section 3 of the report, and the detail of the staffing is in the table at the bottom of page 28 and 29 of the report. So taking you back to the recommendation, the Climate Change and Sustainability Committee are asking the Executive Committee to approve the staffing proposals in respect of the Climate Change South Lanarkshire Fund. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Geraldine. Looking for comments from colleagues, and I see Robert has his hand up.
Thanks very much, Chair. Against the point I made at the leaders' meeting about the, I think when we approved this at the Climate Change Committee, we thought it would sort of take immediate effect, as it were, and clearly there's a delay. Now, there's a balance between the need to have a corporate view, if you like, through the Executive Committee of the spending proposals, and the need to be expeditious, particularly on, if I may say so, on climate change matters, on which there's a certain speed perhaps is required, if you like. I just wondered if I could have the assurance I had from the Chief Executive. We'll have a look at that to see if we can kind of balance the thing a bit better for future arrangements of this kind. Thank you.
Yeah, I think at the leaders' meeting, Robert, we had agreed that Cleland would go away and look to see if there was any way that we could possibly come to some sort of compromise on that item. I'll bring Cleland in just to give some confirmation.
Okay, Leader, I can do so, but I see Geraldine's got her hand up. I'll maybe come in after Geraldine's input, if that's okay.
Okay, Geraldine.
Geraldine, you're on mute.
First person to be muted, Councillor Loudon. If we would need to slightly tweak the terms of reference in 1.12 in particular, and that's the one that says that it's if there's any resources to be committed, it has to come back to the Executive Committee for approval. But we can look at that, and we could take it to the Council meeting in June if members were wanting to do that.
So, I think that would be worthwhile. Cleland.
So, Chair, just given if committee are happy to endorse that suggestion, we'll do that. But just for the full committee's information, as we discussed at the group leaders meeting earlier, just to give a confirmation, these decisions that are before you relate predominantly to the staff post that will take forward the individual work streams, etc. It was just to give an assurance that we're not hanging fire. We can mobilise and take things forward as quickly as possible, because we would not make appointments before the Executive Committee got to endorse this. And if the Executive Committee reversed the decision of the Climate Change Committee, then we could fall in line with that, but no damage. But we will not hang fire and wait sequentially and create a delay. And I think that's what Councillor Brown's concern was originally about. But if committee are good with the proposal, as Geraldine's indicated, we will bring back a proposed adjustment to the terms of reference in June.
Thanks. Before I ask for that approval, I see Alec has his hand up. Alec?
Yeah, my understanding what Geraldine said would give the Climate Change Committee powers of decision and budgeting. I would be rather nervous about that, whereas I completely agree with what we discussed on Monday, and Cleland has indicated just now about taking things forward to a stage where they can still be stopped if the executive took a different view is good and is good practice. But I would not like to see particularly budgeting matters openly decided by a subcommittee like the climate change. even with restrictions on that. I think that does need to come back to the executive.
I think Geraldine was pretty clear in her statement, Alec, that it would only be resources that had already been put aside, that we wouldn't be looking at committing the council to anything which hadn't already been committed. But I'll bring Cleland in on that.
Chair, you beat me to it. It's exactly that. Hopefully that's an assurance for Councillor Allison. This would be about the authority by the Climate Change Committee to take decisions in relation to budget decisions that the Executive Committee or full Council had already made. It would not give the Climate Change Committee powers to incur expenditure that's not authorised through those routes. But you beat me to it.
On that basis that we're not committing expenditure that hasn't already been planned, can this committee agree to raising that at the full council?
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you very much. We'll now move on. So I would move the recommendations of the recommendations on this item and look for a seconder there.
I'll second, Chair.
Fine. Can I get agreement from the committee?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. We move on to items for noting. Item 7 is the neighbourhood planning update, and I would invite Rhonda to give a report on this, please. Rhonda.
Thank you very much, Chair. So the purpose of this report is to provide an update for members on neighbourhood and community-led planning across the area. You'll see in section 3 the background with the Community Planning Partnership having a statutory duty to work with areas where the outcomes are poorest to produce plans. But in section 3.4, you will see that the local ambition is actually much broader than the requirement in the statutory duty there, that the activity would be an investment within the communities to get people engaged and to build capacity to produce and to deliver on their plans. Section 4 talks about the progress to date. So the first 3 plans were brought online in 2019, and a second phase of plans again in 2018, covering 7 different wards there. In addition to this, we realise that there are a host of other communities who are already working to produce community-led plans, for example, down in Clydesdale, where there's a large number of communities with their own plans, and also Westwood and East Kilbride, where we've worked alongside them using our processes and using our tools, but the community have led on producing a plan, although they're not part of the identified neighbourhood planning areas. Section 5 gives an explanation of how the SIMD is used to identify areas which need more input. And also 5.3, the updated SIMD from 2020 has looked across the whole area, and there's been some other areas identified which then influence the future work plan we're looking at in section 6. So there has been some delays to the process because of the pandemic. I'm sure you'll understand both staff time was diverted towards response, and communities were obviously very occupied in their quite tremendous response work. So there was support for that going on. However, now bringing back on stream the work and looking at progressing the areas in Rutherglen and Fernhill and Whitehill and Hamilton, and also a few of the Ward 19 areas over the next year with support, intensive capacity to build and support for these areas, and then moving into 2022-23. You'll see that there's a further 3 areas identified for the same sort of work. But again, returning to the end of the paper in section 6.4 and 6.5, very aware that communities are doing this work themselves and that this should be recognised. So we'll continue to work to support other communities to be able to deliver on their plans and to make sure they have the contacts that they need to help them to do so, and also make use of the priorities across all of the plans in terms of the CPP locality work which we're beginning to develop, and also when we're looking at strategic priorities for new council and community plans. And just ending finally with an encouragement to any community who hasn't been involved in this yet, where elected members could perhaps encourage them to take up the opportunity, and there will be support that can be provided to them as detailed throughout the paper. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rhonda. No, I found this report very good. I'm surprised we're actually as far on as we are regarding the pandemic. I'm heavily involved myself in the Fairhill Fair Play, and recently on the Low Waters Edelwood, which is just starting to come together. Our second meeting's tomorrow night, so and there's a lot of interest from the community, so I'm really happy to see this going ahead. I'm looking for colleagues' comments. I see Maureen, you have your hand up.
Yeah, John, just to say, yes, it's actually in some ways the last year has galvanised some of the work, because people have got together to respond to what was happening in their own neighbourhoods, their own communities around the pandemic, and got more interested and therefore wanted to continue. I know in some areas it's more difficult, it's more challenging, but that's what's good about this approach, is that Rhonda's team and other partners can go in and support the areas where it's more difficult to bring people together and people are maybe unsure about getting together and what they can achieve, whereas other communities, for example, we recently took part in the launch of the Lark Hall community plan, and the Lark Hall community had come together, worked together, did a huge amount of work, and a wee bit late, but kind of because of the pandemic, but launched an excellent plan and are carrying on with that work. So I think all the different, the kind of more nuanced approach, if you like, and following where communities want you to go, I think has been really, really helpful. And I know we're kind of well on our road to, kind of stated objective that Cleland's got, which is to kind of have a plan for every neighbourhood and begin to stitch them up so that they look good, begin to make sense at locality level, and then eventually as we get to produce our community plan next year, they're stitched up so that communities can see in the community plan and the council plan, there's my bit of the plan, here's what I said needed done, and it's in there. And I think that takes a lot of work to get there, and it'll not be perfect, but we'll get there over the next couple of years, and people hopefully will begin to see the difference.
Thanks so much, Maureen. I don't see right, Alec, would you like to come in?
It's looking just for some clarifications. For instance, in my own ward, I think there is roughly about 6 plans currently being drawn up by various communities, if you like. How is that going to be integrated? Are we going to leave that number in the one ward? I notice in the report it tends to be on a ward basis that the report is coming through. Will all of these be able to work independently?
Rhonda?
Thank you. So we recognise that in terms of neighbourhood-based work, people will recognise their own communities and the boundaries of that, and they want to have their own plan that reflects the needs within that area. The CPP work's now looking at locality level work, which will begin to stitch together, as Cleland often speaks about it, the priorities across these plans. So within those plans, there will be some that are specific to each neighbourhood and that they want to work on for their own particular small community, and there will be other ones which are shared priorities across localities that we would look to bring people together to think about at that level. So it's very much about identifying with communities or by communities, what are your priorities that you want to see for your area, and where do they sit appropriately? Do they sit with yourselves in that area? Do they sit across a locality working alongside a bigger community, or do they become a strategic priority because there's something that we're recognising across the whole of South Lanarkshire? I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Rhonda. I see Peter. Peter, you have got your hand up. Peter.
Yeah, just to clarify what happened in Lark Hall, because Alex's questions is a really good one. It's the Lark Hall community identified itself. The ward actually takes in the village of Quarter, but no one in Quarter would identify as being in Lark Hall. So the community plan with regard to who was in and who was out was down to the community itself. And if in a rural area like Alex, obviously those villages and areas will know themselves what makes a community, and it's up to them to identify that, rather than try and shoehorn communities together, which would never work. I mean, Quarter, for instance, would never identify with Lark Hall as being their base. Hamilton's quarter space, and everybody knows it. So that's the sort of thing that happens throughout this process. But it's so important for communities to self-identify rather than to be shoehorned. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Peter. I see David, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'd just like to say this is a very encouraging report and a very encouraging process that we're all on. What I would seek to do is, obviously, as these community plans adapt and go forward, they will be setting the agenda in their locality and at a wider, when we have these plans knitted together, that's an agenda that the council will have to adapt to. I suppose my question to Cleland is, do we have the capacity and the agility to adapt to these ever-moving agendas, but that are coming from the communities, from the grassroots up? Thank you, Chair.
Cleland, I'll bring you in. You better not say no.
So the key aspect, and maybe just to take a step back, is the terminology. Sometimes it gets a bit confusing between neighbourhood planning, locality planning, etc., and it's used in other contexts like health and social care. But where this kind of approach started off with, and it's an unfortunate term, but it was community-led action planning, CLAPS. So the key component of that is community-led. And Alec, if I think of the example he's given, the communities will self-identify. I think that was Peter's point, that if you live in a particular community, you'll know the kind of boundary around that. And we should go at our communities should not be held back at the pace that everybody has to go at. If they can go quicker, if they can work up their own plans, and we've seen some really good community-led action plans that have been developed without a huge amount of investment within the council in terms of the capacity point that Councillor Shearer mentions. So we need to ensure that we bring that together, and Councillor Chalmers is right. My aspiration is to have every community in South Lanarkshire with a community-led action plan. Now, most of the elements of those this is not about creating a to-do list that communities then hand to the NHS or to Police Scotland or to the council and say, right, crack on with it. This is about us providing support for them to do that work and to try to support and facilitate communities to deal with some of the priorities that they want to see delivered. So in terms of capacity, if every one of those communities turned around and just handed us a shopping list or a wish list for investment, no, we couldn't. No authority in Scotland could do that. What we can do is work alongside those communities to help those communities then deliver the priorities or things that matter to them. And not everything is a bit of infrastructure or a concrete asset that needs to be developed. It might be about their capacity. It might be about the networks that they deliver. And some of the things we've seen through the pandemic is just how effective those community networks can be in making sure that they take forward local priorities, they support the vulnerable within their communities, and they actually make their communities thrive. So that's maybe a longer-winded answer to Councillor Shearer, but just to be absolutely clear, this is not a process to facilitate people producing a shopping list that they hand to the council to deliver.
Thanks very much, Cleland. I don't see any other hands raised, so I'm going to move the recommendation.
I'll second, Chair.
Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Can we move on to item 8, which is elected members return to office accommodation, pages 39 to 42. And can I have Geraldine?
Thank you, Chair. This report advises committee of the proposals for the elected members' return to office accommodation. I seem to be getting a wee bit of feedback, I'm sorry. As you know, the council is currently closed to the public with limited exceptions in line with the Scottish Government guidance, and the advice still is that elected members and employees of the council work from home where possible, with essential meetings, face-to-face meetings only being permitted. Scottish Government has been working through a strategic framework based on health advice, and currently the council area is sitting at level 2 as of the 17th of May, and we're due to move to level 1, all going well, on the 7th of June, and then to level 0 in late June. In levels 2 and in level 1, working from home is still the recommended position where possible. It's intended to ease in late June, and that would allow a phased and limited return to the office, but that wouldn't be a free-for-all with everybody being allowed to come back at the same time, because we will still have to work around restrictions and to have mitigation measures in place, as explained in section 4.2 and 4.3 of the report. And we are currently doing that. We're currently working with the health and safety team to prepare risk assessments for the elected members' accommodation in the headquarters and in Beckford Street, and also to prepare safe systems of work. These should be ready by the 4th of June, and we will share them with elected members by email in advance, and answer any questions or issues that elected members will have. It's also recommended that any elected member who requires a personal evacuation plan should still work from home, because there may be insufficient members of staff or others within the office to effect a safe evacuation. But we can discuss that with any elected member to whom that applies. It's also recommended in section 4.4 of the report that we have some sort of booking system or a rota that can be updated on a weekly basis, so that we can keep the numbers within the elected members' accommodation within the safe levels. Now, that is something that I'm happy to discuss offline with political group leaders, because currently not quite sure how that would work, but I'm sure you all have your views on how that would work. Members would still be able to work from home, but if they needed to come into the office, they could really indicate on the booking system that they need to come in, and we can then advise on how many other people are likely to be in at that time and whether it's safe. It'll be a negotiation process. That's where we're going to be probably for some time. I would hope to be able to come to you with regard to the booking system by the 25th of June, so that if we do move to level 0 around about that time, from then on, you would be able to use that to come into the office. So taking you back to the recommendations, just asking for the report to be noted. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Geraldine. We had a discussion at the leaders' meeting on Monday morning, where all the leaders present more or less came to a decision that we thought the best way forward would be, instead of a rota system, that we looked at the business manager for each group taking control of who wouldn't be in the office at any particular time. So that's maybe something that maybe we want to take forward. I see further down Joe has his hand up, so he may want to relate to this as well. But I see Gladys's hand's up first, so we'll take Gladys's hand just now. Gladys.
Thanks very much, Chair. While there is a planned return to the office, albeit on a rota basis, the pandemic's changed the way most organisations operate, and while in the old days of 2019, many private sector were quite happy to have staff working from home. In the public sector, staff were always expected in the office 9 to 5 and managed through time management, in some cases physically clocking in. But most of the organisations, both private and public, have seen that their productivity hasn't been reduced, with the majority of staff working from home, and in many cases it has actually increased. Staff are no longer wasting time travelling to and from work. And Alexa agrees with me. You can hear that in the background. People are not travelling to meetings, are not wasting time sitting in traffic. And I think, you know, if people are not returning to the old 95 model, that truly reflects a work-life balance for people. So with this, I'm hoping that South Lanarkshire will continue to welcome a blended approach to the office and home for staff and for councillors. And going forward, we have a blended approach to committees. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks for your comments, Gladys. This is probably not the time to take this. This will be a decision that we'll need to take at some point. This is more about the safety of work of our members on their return to office as and when they wish to be in the office. But yes, thanks very much for your comments on that. I would agree that that's probably the best way forward. Joe, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Some of the remarks I was going to make have indeed been preempted. I think, just to follow up from what you alluded to, the discussion at that we did have amongst leaders, I think that term rota, in particular, we understand, and I think we all understand, the need to have safe systems of work, not just for the councillors who are returning to the building at some point, but actually also for the members of staff who are there to support us. And whatever happens as the restrictions ease, there is going to be a return to the building, and we're going to be there in increased numbers. So obviously that has to take place. That's a given, in a way which incorporates safe systems of work. There's the hazards with conducting these things at home. Alexa goes off and phones go off that you thought were switched off. But I have to say, the term rota, I think what we've got to remember is, even before the crisis, the way in which the pattern of work for a councillor is different. There could be 64 different patterns of work in South Lanarkshire Council for how councillors approach their jobs. Some people have other jobs that we work around, other people have families, other people. And actually, to a large extent, remote working was something that councillors, more than other members of staff, had done before the crisis anyway. The point I'm making is that a rota system, it feels a bit clunky, and it doesn't really feel that it would fit around the pattern of work for councillors. So I'm just looking for the clarification there that term and that approach is withdrawn. And I think what pending discussion with the business managers, and I think what we are alluding to is, or not alluding to, we're now saying much more explicitly, is that there is going to be a period in which we're going to have to control the numbers in the building. And I think the term booking system sounded much more, much more productive, and I think and probably much reflects the reality of how councillors would be working. So I think I'm just looking for the clarity from yourself, Chair. I think that's what we've agreed, and I know that the other group leaders are have expressed similar concerns from their groups, that we can maybe take the concept of the rota off the table, have the discussion with the business managers, and then we can come back with some kind of proposal that allows us to incorporate safe systems of work. And I think that would reflect much more accurately the reality of what it's like. And also, remember, there is support, the reality of working as a councillor and accessing the support that many of us need to access in that building.
Thanks, Joe. I would be in agreement with that. What we'll do is we'll return to see if, in general, everybody's in agreement with that and would have that removed. But I'll ask those members that have their hand up first to make comment before we return to that. Okay. So I see Alan Falconer has his hand up. Alan.
Yeah.
Not hearing you, Alan. Alan, I'll give you some time. I'll go to Alec just now and we'll return to you when you have clarity. Alec?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Regarding the rota, very much what Joe was saying in terms of how that would work and why. But the other thing to remember is that attendance at the building for a lot of our members tended to tie in with committee meetings. So therefore, when we come back to either face-to-face meetings, blended meetings or whatever, will be part of the profile of when people are wanting to be in the office. The other thing I just noticed this morning, it was highlighted to me this morning, was at 4.2, we're advised that anyone who requires personal evacuation plan to work. No, that's not the bit. Sorry, the basic bit is that if you need support to get out of the building in an emergency, you should not attend. That will certainly affect well, at least one of our members, and I don't know whether it would affect Jerry or not. And it's no, I mean, because you take the lift, Jerry, and if they're not working in an evacuation, it's how you can get out safely. That is actually, is that not discrimination? Is there nothing we can do about that?
Cleland, can I bring you in on that one?
Yeah, just to be absolutely clear, this is a pandemic situation. So the numbers of staff in offices, and let's take Almada Street as the core office at the moment, is a small fraction of the normal pre-pandemic numbers of staff in the building. Someone who has a personal evacuation plan, a PEP or a PEEP, would require support from a number of staff members to evacuate the building. If there are insufficient numbers of staff in any location to safely evacuate someone out of the building, it's not discrimination in the sense of preventing someone accessing the building, it's a safety issue. The member, like all other members have been doing, can still undertake their functions remotely, and we've facilitated that. This is about a member coming into the building for any particular purpose that requires them to come into the building. And if there's a member of an elected member of the authority who requires support but is unable to be safely evacuated, then we'll support them in another way without them coming into the building. So it's simply a situation. I don't want somebody coming into the building on the anticipation that there would be a number of members of staff to help them evacuate the building. And if I look at something like an evac chair, which could require 2 or 3 members of staff to support an elected member, depending on their size, to come out of the building. If there's not 2 or 3 members of staff in that location, then we need to provide that support to the elected member elsewhere. Is that helpful, Chair?
Yeah, that's helpful. I think that explains the situation. Are you quite happy with that, Alec?
Yeah, but just following on, Cleland, then, are you wanting us to give you the names of anyone who we would put in that category?
We know, Alec. So those who require a personal emergency evacuation plan, that's the full title of that, we know. So if someone on a temporary basis, for example, somebody fell down and hurt their leg in such a way that they couldn't traverse the stairs, etc., we would ask the elected member to make us aware of that and to be sensible in terms of booking time in the office. Basically, very, very simply, if you can't evacuate yourself, then you need to contact member services for access to support, because we might not be able to evacuate in the circumstances where there's only a fraction of staff in place. It's purely a safety issue, not a discriminatory issue. We'll make sure that elected members get all the support they need to undertake the functions. It's simply about accessing a particular building.
Thanks very much. Alan, are you online now?
I'm online, Chair, thanks.
Thank you very much.
My point's been covered. I have 2 points. The first point has been covered with Cleland and Alec in the personal evacuation plan. I've mentioned several times in the opposition, we don't have an evacuee chair, but it should be there. We have several members who have got mobility issues, and in confidence I'll no name names, but an evacuee chair should already be there and be provided. My second one is I'm working from home, both with my work and both with the council, and I've been in the office a few times, and I'm more safe in the office than I'm at home, because my wife's a home help, and she's in, along with 500 other home helps, giving personal care to people, and with a director of social work saying, oh, they've got all the PPE and the social distance. I've still to find out how you can social distance when you're showering somebody or changing incontinence garments. Just a point. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alec. Cleland, I see you still have your hand up. Is that a legacy hand?
No, maybe just to come back on that point, I understand that Councillor Faulkner identified that the evac chair had been removed, I believe, and perhaps Danny can confirm that's now been reinstalled in the opposition area of the member services. However, my point is an evac chair doesn't evacuate itself, it requires the support of the staff. And I'm glad Councillor Faulkner does feel safe when he comes into the building, because that's not by happenstance, that's by planning, and that is about physical distancing and managing the numbers within the building. And the final point, I'm quite happy if Councillor Faulkner wants to contact me offline. All of our social care staff have safe systems of work, which is based on national guidance published by Public Health Scotland in relation to the use of PPE and what that means in relation to providing personal care. So in particular, I don't want to isolate this to his wife, but if there's any employee who works in social care who's in any way concerned about their own safety and the use of PPE in undertaking their job, then they should raise that with their line manager, because there is copious amounts of training and detailed planning around the provision of those services. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks very much. I don't see any other hands raised, so I'm going to move the recommendation.
I'll second, Chair.
Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Thanks very much. We'll move on to item 9, which is equalities mainstreaming, pages 43 to 146. Can I invite Kay to report on this, please?
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm delighted to bring this report to the committee. This report obviously gives us a progress update on where we're at with the last set of equality outcomes, but also sets out our mainstreaming report for the next 4 years. So members will be well aware of the legislative background round about our specific duties as a public authority. And at 3.3, you can see the items that the range of items that were required to contain within the report. So in terms of our equality outcomes, that's a 4 yearly update, and in between times you have a 2 yearly update regarding progress. So this report is covering both of those. In terms of the period 2019 to 2021, so we're at the end of the 4 year period, Section 4 takes us through some of the highlights that are in the very comprehensive report that is attached at Appendix 1. And these are just some small and large highlights, but they're all detailed in full, so I would encourage members to take a good look at that. So in terms of the outcomes we have focused on, as I said, some are large, some are small, all have made a significant difference to the individuals that we're hoping to support through this. And as folk will know, some have been impacted by COVID over the past year as well, so we've had to make some significant adjustments. So at 4.4, you can see the bullets, which take us through a lot of the highlights that are part of regular items that members will hear about in the various committees. So things like our support for the home care service, for example, and the increase we've had there. I think there are some other items that I would draw members' attentions to, maybe just reflecting on the COVID situation. So if you think about the men's sheds, which we were all very excited to kickstart, then the impact of COVID-19 meant we had to close men's sheds as a result. And then we were thinking very carefully about how we could support the shedders as part of that process. And actually within the report, you'll see we've enabled that group to gain an entirely new set of skills through the medium of social media platforms. They've all become familiar with things like WhatsApp, Zoom, Facebook, etc., perhaps technology that they weren't familiar with before. And we've done that through support with the Seniors Together team, for example. There's been a lot of good work undertaken with vulnerable communities, vulnerable individuals, and again, they're all detailed there from a service perspective in those bullets. In terms of engaging with members of the community, and this probably flows on quite nicely from the earlier report, we have had a lot of contact in order to better understand their lived experience and therefore take that in to the outcomes that are in the new report. So you'll see in terms of participation, further down at page 45, we've got some encouraging figures. So if I keep on the mobile men's shed as an example there, We had over 2,000 individuals involved in that project, really hitting the mark in terms of reaching out to isolated folk who were perhaps not in touch with other members of their community and getting that pulled back together. Again, probably another good example would be the Gypsy Traveller sites becoming involved in the investment master plans, and obviously a fair bit of consultation there with site residents as well. From an employee perspective, we keep the consultation going through our employee network, covering the various aspects of protected characteristics. And again, just featuring a little bit at the start of page 46, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a significant chunk of work undertaken there, particularly around about the helpline for the shielded individuals during the pandemic, where actually the good work of the council and the good work of the communities came together and focused very much on those that had need to respond in very creative ways. So you're kind of really harnessing the powers of the community network in that response. In terms of the workforce, if I can turn to that section 5, there is a new aspect of the report that you'll not have seen necessarily in terms of our reports before. So the pay gap figures, in previous years we would have reported on average. We're now reporting on average pay gap and the median or the midpoint in terms of pay gap. So that led a little extra to our analysis. In terms of the workforce profile figures that you can see in the report, they're reflective of the makeup of the council as at the 31st of March 2020. It always lags by a year, folk will remember. But I'm pleased to report it does show steady progress. So in terms of employees from a Black and ethnic minority background, for example, we're seeing steady progress there. In terms of our gender pay gap, again, we're seeing a steady improvement there. And I'm particularly pleased about that because obviously we were changing our pay model in order to better address our gender pay gap. And it's good to see that the work we've done round about the increments has had a positive impact on that. In amongst that, although, we still have some work to do and we'll continue to do that, and that's reflected in the outcomes for the next 4 years. I think in particular the report draws your attention at 5.4 to an issue that we can see. So we have a negative pay gap in the teachers' side, so that's women being paid more than men, just explain that. But equally we've got still a gender pay gap focused in at grade 2, but I would reassure you that we do thoroughly understand why that is the case, particularly in amongst our part-time workforce. So we have an issue there with some higher paid men perhaps taking some flexible retirement at grade 2, and conversely we've got some women earlier on in their career, perhaps through childcare responsibilities, working part-time at that side. So it's good to go through this information because it does give us a thorough understanding of why things are the way they are. At 5.6, we're reporting, again, the general increase that we've had over the period in terms of the proportion of women as in the top 5% of earners in the council. So section 6 takes you through the mainstreaming equalities outcome report for the next 4 years. And we're very much focused on the advice that we've received from the Equalities and Human Rights Commission in the drafting of the outcomes. And as you would expect, there's been fairly extensive consultation round about those that we've selected. So at 6.2 there you can see the highlight of the areas that we would look to choose to focus on over the next 4 years. And you'll see those in the bullets at 6.2. So in terms of next step for this report, the outcomes will continue to be monitored, and again they'll be reported back through in the cycle that we have been following. And I'm asking the committee to note the content of the report, and I'm happy to address any questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Kay. I see Robert has his hand up. Robert?
Yes, thanks very much. I think this is...
You've went on mute, Robert.
Clicked it. That's better. Thank you. I think it's an excellent report with a lot to be pleased about in terms of the direction of travel in what is really a very complex area with a whole lot of issues. You know, we may need to come back in due course to things like smallish numbers of men in education, things like that. The thing I wanted to ask about, though, was really the senior management end of things, where manifestly the sort of sets the target as the visible bit in some ways. We've got obviously a limited number of women, in fact, reducing number of women in the corporate management team. But more important in a way is the actual the service leads and heads of department and things like that below that, from which the pool comes. And I think it might be useful if Cleland could say something about I think his plans, which I think are useful in this context, to try and address the widening of the pool, so to speak, which I think is an important aspect of all of this.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Yeah, Cleland had something to say about this on Monday. Cleland, do you want to come in?
Yeah, Chair, very quickly, I'll share the same anecdote. When I went to Midlothian, I was at committee noting the indicator for female employees in the top 5% of earners going from a green to a red, and I realised it was because I'd been appointed and replaced my predecessor, who was a woman, and I apologise for being appointed. I think that it hasn't gone past me that, with the exception now of Kay and Kath, who are members of CMT, all other members are male. We need to ensure that we recognise some of the additional barriers that managers coming through the system may face as women. They can range from care responsibilities or expectations, should I say, to just confidence levels. And there is documented evidence that men put themselves forward for positions much more readily than women, regardless of their abilities, etc. So we've been working for some time, and Kate has been leading on restarting the management development programme, which we've had in South Lanarkshire over a longer period of time, but potentially lost a bit of focus over recent years, and also a leadership programme which will support all. It's talent spotting. It's supporting all managers as they come through the system, right from the first supervisory grades all the way through to replacing us, to give them that support. Now, we had it ready to rock and roll last year, and then the pandemic hit. And I think what Councillor Brown's alluding to is we have looked at it, revised it to reflect a kind of pandemic period and how we deliver some of that support on a virtual basis. But we are ready to launch, and maybe Kay can give an indication around the kind of dates around that. But the intention is to make sure that both male and female, but specifically female for this context, supervisors and managers with qualities and ability are properly supported into progressing their career, so that we get a better balance in terms of our senior management. Now, in different sectors, as Kay's mentioned, it actually can go in the reverse. We've got a significantly higher proportion of primary head teachers who are female than male, and sometimes that hides the overall picture. But the intention is to try and get that balance in place. And the final anecdote, which I used the other day there, is with me coming to South Lanarkshire to replace our previously male chief executive and being replaced in Argyll and Bute by a female chief executive. I think for the first time ever, there is now 17 female chief executives and 15 male chief executives. So there's a blueprint for us to kind of follow.
Thanks very much, Cleland. I think that's the proper way forward to see if we can get the right balance, and that's to be commendable. I don't see any other hands raised, so I'm going to move the recommendations.
I'll second, Chair.
Thanks very much. Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Can we move on then to item 10, which is Strategic Environmental Assessment Progress, pages 147 to 150. And Michael, if you can report on this, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just really a brief report for members to note the progress of undertaking strategic environmental assessments. We're required to do this via the Environmental Assessments Act, and we have to do that for all of our policies, plans and programmes and strategies. And the purpose of this is to integrate environmental considerations in how we go about preparing our strategies and plans. And in turn, this promotes the Council's commitment to sustainability, which is a key priority for the Sustainable Development and Climate Change strategy. So, whilst, Chair, it's not a legal requirement to report on the SEA progress, I think it's good practice to do that. And also, I think it's just as important now that we do this with increased attention to sustainability and the climate change issues. So very briefly, in section 4, we set out the progress in undertaking SEAs, and that's in a 3-stage process where you go through a pre-screening exercise to determine whether an SEA is required. And you'll see in table 1 below 4.3 where that has been considered and SEAs are not required. Subsequently, if an SEA is required, these are fully undertaken, and you'll see that 3 plans in table 2 where an SEA is being undertaken, and that relates to air quality, contaminated land, and the local development plan 2. And the final stage of the process is to look at post-adoption statements, and at this point in time, Chair, there are no plans at that particular stage. So this is very much a mainstream activity now, but as I said before, in terms of the heightened increase in climate change and environmental issues, I think it is good practice to give an update to members and give them the comfort that environmental considerations are very much at the forefront of our minds when we're preparing plans and strategies. So, Chair, just returning to the recommendation, just asking members to note the contents of the report. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Are there any colleagues with any questions or comments? I don't see any hands up, so I'm going to move recommendation.
I'll second, Chair.
Thanks very much. We agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. Move on to item 11, which is amendments to working group. Can I ask Geraldine to report on this, please?
Thank you, Chair. This report advises Committee of action taken under Standing Order number 36C in response to a request from the leader of the independent group to change her membership on the South Lanarkshire Leisure and Culture Cross-Party Working Group, the Hamilton Divisional Licensing Board and the Recruitment Committee. And it was taken under section 36C because all of the meetings of these various groups or committees predated the date of this committee. So the outcome is noted in the report. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much. I would move the recommendation.
I'll second, Chair.
Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Thanks very much. There'll be no other business. I would thank everyone for turning up today. The Climate Change Committee was due to start at 11:30, but in order for everyone to have a comfort break, we'll put the start of that meeting back to 11:45.